Hello, I'm Majat Ahmed. I'm a visiting faculty at OP Jindal Global University. Today we are going to talk about definition and types of migration and what are the learning outcomes of the module. Help the learners to get an overview of the concepts and terminologies pertaining to migration, which is complex. Help students to capture the different forms of migration and the complexities arising out of the issues of migration in the context of human rights. The issue of migration is not a new phenomenon, and it has its roots from prehistoric era. Migrations have occurred due to factors like wars, conquests, invasions, climate issues such as natural calamities, etc. There have been mass migrations around the world. For example, the Aryans moved to India during the Harappan civilization. The Israelites moved out from Egypt to Canaan. Further, we have also seen large migrations during the Industrial Revolution and the World Wars. Migration has occurred due to social, economic, and cultural factors, both during the ancient, medieval, and modern times, wherein human beings have moved from one place to another individually, as a group, and even mass migrations have occurred since the recent past. There have been a number of factors that have caused migration, which will be discussed in detail in the next module. There have been different avenues leading to migration, such as unemployment, better quality of life, etc. The issue of migration is not wrong, but there are some restrictions in the context of sovereignty of the countries which have their own laws governing migrations. The issue of human rights arises in the context of migration when the element of freedom in movement is restricted or subjected to exploitation and deprives the rights of the migrants whose dignity, justice, equality, security, and liberty is at stake. There have been a number of issues regarding the human rights of the migrants. Hence, this module will help the learners to understand the concepts and factors relating to migration in detail and it will provide an opportunity to know the issues in a larger perspective. Now, let's look at the meaning of migration and a migrant. The term migration is an act of an individual or group who cross their traditional boundary within a state from one state to another, of one county to another, which is part of a sovereign or administrative unit for a certain period of time. Migration includes the movement of individuals, refugees, people affected by disasters or victims of war, affected country, and mainly the economic migrants, which can be internal or external in nature. In the process of migration, an individual moves from his or her own original place of residence to a destination they can choose to go due to a number of factors causing such migration. Similarly, a migrant means an individual who temporarily or permanently moves away from one place to another, which can be within and outside the state of the country where he or she was not born. Under the Indian law, there is no specific definition to refer who is a migrant. However, There is a very narrow definition made in the Interstate Migrant Workers Act 1979, referring to who is an interstate migrant worker. Any person who is recruited by or through a contractor in one state under an agreement or other agreement for employment in an establishment in another state, whether with or without the knowledge of the principal employer in relation to such establishment, which is limited to economic activity. In the Indian federal system, there's only one citizenship to all citizens, hence it's a constitutional right given to the citizens under Article 19(1)(d) and to move freely to reside and settle in any part of the territory of India. For specific purposes, such terminology is put to use, for example, Census of India, National Sample Survey, etc. Under the Foreigners Act 1946, any person who is not a citizen of India will be considered as a foreigner. This definition is applicable to people who legally migrate to the Indian territory in the same way if an individual enters or resides inside the country may lead to illegal immigration due to reasons like expiry of visas, overstaying, crossing the territorial border without permission. This issue will be discussed in detail in Chapter 5. Now we'll look at forms of migration. So what are the forms of migration? There are different forms of migration that take place within and outside of the country. Some of the important forms of migration are listed below in detail. First, we will start with the intrastate migration, interstate migration, and inter-country migration. So migration occurs in a variety of scales. One form of migration pattern is discussed now below. The intrastate migration is a type of migration that takes place between two parts of the same state by an individual or group. For example, Bidar district in North Karnataka, farmers migrate to Bangalore district in South Karnataka and are residing and working in construction sites for daily wages is termed as intra-state migration, that is occurring within the state. The interstate migration, on the other hand, means migration between two states within the country, that is along the border between two states. For example, construction laborers from the state of Andhra Pradesh migrate to the state of Karnataka for employment is part of interstate migration, meaning this is a migration between two states. Number of intrastate migration and interstate migrants in the country is duration of the residence 0 to 9 years by rural urban status India 2001, rural urban status of place of last residence, rural urban status of place of enumeration, migration streams and internal migrants. So let's look at the migration streams. In the internal migration, people move from either within their own state or move out of the state to another, as well as in other forms. The streams he or she migrates to include rural, urban areas, same district or other district, same state or other state, or from other countries. It may be noted that the migrants in any area may be 1. From within the state, 2nd, from other states, 3rd, from another country. Total migrants, considering the migration streams 1 and 2, together constitute the volume of internal migrants. The following table gives details of the migration stream in India documented during the 2001 census. Migration not only occurs within the country but also between two countries, which are known as inter-country migration. There are two terminologies often connected to inter-country migration. That is, immigration simply means he or she coming in from one state or country which they originally do not belong to in order to settle there temporarily or permanently, and emigration, EMI, is the opposite, where he or she comes out to a new state or country and are called emigrants. The Immigration Act 1983, passed by the Government of India, defines emigrant as any citizen of India who intends to emigrate or emigrates or has emigrated but does not include a dependent of an immigrant, whether such dependent accompanies that immigrant or departs subsequently for the purpose of joining that immigrant in the country to which that immigrant has lawfully immigrated. Second, any person who has resided outside India at any time after attaining the age of 18 years for not less than 3 years, or the spouse or child of such person. Section 21D. Emigrate meaning any person who makes a departure from his or her home state with a view to taking up any employment in any country or place outside India. Rural and urban migration. Internal migrants are commonly classified into the following four migration streams. A. Rural to rural. B. Rural to urban. C. Urban to urban. D. Urban to rural. From the above streams, the most important pattern that has been a concern in India especially is people migrating from rural to urban for a number of reasons, such as failure in agricultural activity, increase in debt. Such reasons force people to move to urban areas which provide attractive opportunities such as employment, better living standards, etc., and is closely connected to forced migrations. Rural to urban migration argument is evident from the table below, taken from the 2000 Census of India report. Labor migration has both positive and negative consequences. Positive aspects include better job, income, standard of living, education, etc. However, the negative consequences are higher, especially in India, which is discussed in Module 3, with special reference to the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act 1979, which was specially enacted to look into the rights of the migrant workers in India. The vast majority of migrant laborers fall in the unorganized sector, who mostly have been recruited from various parts of the country through contractors or agents commonly known as sardars, who move these laborers to other states where national and multinational projects are available, which involves various kinds of abuses, which is elaborately discussed in chapters 5. Even immigrant laborers who move to other countries for employment, especially in the unorganized sectors like construction, domestic workers, etc., face serious physiological and sexual abuse. Immigrant laborers who seek temporary employment opportunities abroad face challenges initially from the recruitment agents and at their work sites. Both internal migrants and immigrants are abused in many forms, including exploitative working conditions, poor living accommodations, restrictions on freedom to organize or bargain collectively, poor wages, non-payment of salaries, sexual abuses, etc. The emigrant workers moving and out of the country are vulnerable to rampant exploitation due to their limited knowledge of relevant laws and procedures for going out as an immigrant worker. The increase in migration, as well as the unhealthy policies of the host countries, further reduce the immigrational benefits to the worker, who also face poor systemic interventions at the national, bilateral, as well as multilateral fronts, even though there are international legal framework and respective national legislative interventions. These issues have been ignored. Let's look at seasonal migration. The seasonal migration is a process where people move for a specific time period, mainly to alternative jobs, which is common in the rural areas, especially in the agricultural cycle. For example, in the Indian coastal regions, 45-day deep-sea fishing ban is put in place annually for the purpose of fish breeding, during which fishermen go in search of alternative jobs. Now, let's look at forced or involuntary migration. Forced or involuntary migration is defined as any person who migrates to escape persecution, conflict, repression, natural and human-made disasters, ecological degradation, or other situations that endanger their lives, freedom, or livelihood. Internal organization for migration. It's also commonly known as internally displaced persons or forced displacement, and cannot be characterized as a refugee because they do not cross over to another country but within. This form of migration invites number of human rights violations even though they are taken care by the government. For example, in India, forced migration is happening, especially by setting up of special economic zones, construction of dams, etc. Now let's look at the difference between migrants and refugees. How are they different? How are migrants and refugees different? The terms migration and refugee may look similar, but they are different. A migrant is a person who makes his or her own personal decision to leave his native state or country for a variety of factors and reasons, legally according to their rights provided by the state, and they can move back to the original place at any time if they want to return. Refugees, on the other hand, are forced to leave their native country as they are under risk of persecution. The term refugee is defined as any person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality and is unable or owing to such there is unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country. Convention related to the status of refugees 1951. The refugees are moved in order to protect their human rights and can return only when the situation improves from where they have come. Under the Indian law, there is no direct reference to refugees and they are considered as foreigners who are not citizens of India. Section 2 of the Foreigners Act 1946. And the issues are dealt on a bilateral discourse. Some examples, like refugees from Bangladesh during the Liberation War, or Sri Lankan Tamils in India during the Civil War in Sri Lanka. This is to note that Article 14 of UDHR 1948 gives the right to asylum, that is, the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Now let's look at illegal migration and trafficking. Any migration by an individual from the country of origin to another country without any legal permission from the concerned authorities from both sides is considered as illegal migration and will not be considered as a refugee and be tried for illegal entry under the laws in force in the country. For example, in India, they will be tried under the Citizenship Act 1955, Foreigners Act 1946, Indian Passport Act 1967, Indian Penal Code 1860, etc. Illegal migration can happen through border crossings, overstaying after the expiry of visa period. The Citizenship Act 1955 defines an illegal migrant as a foreigner who has entered into India, number 1, without a valid passport or other travel documents, and such other document or authority as may be prescribed by or under any law in that behalf, or with a valid passport or other travel documents and such other document or authority as may be prescribed by or under any law in that behalf, but remains therein beyond the permitted period of time. Human rights issues are a concern in the context of illegal migration, problems faced by the host or receiving country. Some of the major violations include human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, slave trade, procuration of minor girls, buying and selling of children and women for prostitution, and criminal activities like smuggling of drugs and weapons, etc., which is evident in many countries even though there are stringent laws in force. The problem of human trafficking, especially children and women, has become a major social issue around the world. Now let's summarize. Migration is a movement of people from one place to another, within or outside the country for the purpose of residing permanently or temporarily in a particular place, and the considerable part of such movement involves a number of purposes which can be due to unemployment, better opportunities in urban settings, failure in crop cultivation in rural areas, etc., to name a few. Migration is not restricted to the distance of the movement, voluntary or forced act, or external and internal migration, because the reasons and consequences of such moves are always different. Any act of migration involves an origin and a destination with challenges. Thank you.